Avoid the maze. Welcome to the journey through life's obstacles and challenges. We all encounter them. We begin 2025 with my guest, Eric G. And as I said to Eric before we came online, uh, I wish I had known him or someone like him when I was going to school because education was really tough for me and I didn't understand why. Eric states he was a bad student when asked about his early school years. He states he was either the teacher's best friend or their worst enemy. We'll learn more about that in a little bit. His brother once said, if Eric doesn't like doing something and it takes longer than 15 minutes, he's just not going to do it. That's the student I was in school, and I got in trouble for that. We're often told that this is a phase we're going to grow out of, and we can fit into the mold and do what we need to do. But I love what Eric says. Why do we have to meet the standards of others? Why can't our standards be part of that? So, Eric, you devoted the last 2 decades of your life, and I think you're quite young looking at you and communicating with you. So, two decades is the majority of your life, but you're helping people forge forward to find their success. So, give us a little bit of background. How did you come to developing something that could probably help millions of people out there?
I think it was a lot of what you were talking about for yourself. I always felt a little different when I was younger. I did get in trouble quite a bit in school. And I think I discovered personality theory or just personality typing methodology probably when I was around 16 or 17. And I just kind of delved into that because I thought, oh, this is really cool because maybe this is the explanation of why. Like some of the things that I prioritize aren't necessarily some of the things that I'm told that I should prioritize. And I started studying that for a few years at least. And after like going through learning about different personality typing methodologies, I started my own company, my own education company, and I owned that for about a decade. And through owning that, I would teach my teachers how to use personality typing to help them. And through that, I started developing my own methodology based on different things that I saw. Like maybe I'm not a big believer. I know people love to use the words extroversion, introversion. That would be a great example of something that I studied, and I do agree with it to a certain extent, but through my experience, I've taught myself, or at least learned for myself, that it's not always the case whether someone's extroverted or introverted. I think that's a bit of a simplification. But
Absolutely. One of the things I liked in this bio was the words of your brother, because so many people, you know, if you're really, if the subject doesn't grab you right there, you're not going to hold on to it. You're just going to slowly keep pulling back from it and back from it. Um, and I learned that quite directly with my youngest son, who now is in his mid 30s and is out on his own and doing well. But he was diagnosed on the autism spectrum. And he had a tough time in school because he sort of like knew things before the teacher talked about them. And so within 5 minutes, he was disengaged because he knew more than what they were going to say. And he used to get in trouble for that. And I spent more days in the principal's office than I ever want to remember. Um, and I used to say to them, I understand the teacher has 30 students in her classroom, but not all 30 students are learning the same amount of information. How difficult is it for you to talk to a teacher to say, hey, we have to sort of do a little bit of everything so we can reach the majority of these students?
with my company, we had the advantage in that we were, giving out one-on-one tutoring, right? So in a way, it was definitely the tutoring was individualized for each student. But I would say most tutoring programs aren't even like that, right? Even if it's one-on-one tutoring, it's like, okay, here's the set of things that you're always going to do with every single student. And it might vary based on skill level or grade level, but you're not going to change how you deal with a student, or I should say, interact with a student. And I think but even then, like I think teachers are so used to like saying this is the right way to do things, this is the certain way to do things. Follow this, and you'll be okay with your 30 or so students. When in fact, even if you have a large class of students, your lessons can remain the same, but it doesn't mean you have to interact with each student in the same way and have the same goals and have the same expectations. And I think that was something that I tried to teach or educate my teachers on because what I'll find, and I don't want to get too wonky into this,
Yeah.
but there are certain personality packs, I call them, of people. And one of those personality packs, so there's four. And then within those four packs, there are four animal personality types, so which makes 16 different personality types. But I explain that because one of the personality packs makes up about half the population. So when you have one set of people making up about half the population, their values are definitely going to be have an outsized impact on society, and their number one priority is safety and security. So it would make sense that a lot of people who get into teaching are part of that personality pack because I do think teaching does lend itself to, creating a safe space where people can learn. So when you think about this prototypical elementary school teacher, what's the first thing you learn? The rules. These are the rules. This is what you do. You put your name first, the date second, on the top right corner or the top left corner, whatever they have to make kids feel like there's some kind of structure. And I think that's a good thing. But of course, as you found with your son, like that doesn't work for everyone. And that's safety and security are not everyone's number one priority. And I think that's what causes a lot of the conflict in the classroom.
Well, it's interesting because, about, God, I guess it's already 30 years. Um, my husband is in IT and he was doing some programming for a company and they needed to be trained. And my husband came to me and he said, why don't you do the training? And I said, well, I'm not a teacher by, profession. I've never really taught. He said, well, yeah, you showed me how to do things. You show our son how to do things. And I thought, okay. So I came in and I looked at this program and it was daunting to me. So the first question I asked him is, please explain to me exactly how this program is supposed to work, but tell me in very simple terms. And that was difficult for him. First, it was very technical, then slightly less. And finally, I got him down and he explained to me. I would go into a classroom with 25 to 30 adults who did not want to learn something new because they liked the old way of doing it. And what I ended up doing was thinking about how would I want to learn this? And I wanted to learn it as quickly as possible, but as in the most simple way. And when I started doing that, I realized my students were picking up on it. And those who had more technical experience, they could figure out different ways of doing it. So I didn't have to slap their hands and say no. They were getting the results they needed. But the people who just weren't sure and they needed one step after another and they needed to write it down so they could keep following it, that was okay. But how do teachers typically, and now you said yours was more tutoring, but how would you tell a teacher in a classroom of 30 students um, how to do this? Because they're all thinking differently. And when I think about my own son, you know, we don't know why he knew history before he learned it in school, but he did. Okay. So how do you get the teacher to engage with these individuals?
I think it's obviously on a case by case basis. I think it's really more about the interaction, right? And the expectation versus, I mean, I feel like the content is going to remain the same, right? It has to, whether it's a high level, low level, average level, whatever. I mean, you got 30 kids, you can't adjust content and curriculum for each kid. That just doesn't work that way. But I do think in terms of like what we allow, like I think, let's say if you're a fox personality type, foxes are very charming. They do not necessarily follow the rules. They'll try to bend them as much as possible. They try to get away with as much as they can. They will shamelessly lie if it puts them in a good position to get what they want. And I think sometimes teachers would really not like that too much, right? They would be like, wait, no, you got to like be honest, be straightforward, follow the rules, et cetera, et cetera. And I think in general, being down on a kid like that can really affect their education process because it's not like when they get older, they're not going to be like that. when they get older, they're going to be like that, but like an outsized version of that, meaning they're going to be your salesperson. They're going to be that person who takes shots and tries things and is going to like try to sell people on stuff. And you want them to be able to take those chances and take those risks without feeling like there's something wrong with them. And I think you have to ingrain that at an early age versus telling them there's something wrong with them, because there's the chance that when they grow up, they're not going to build on those strengths because they've been told that there's something wrong with them, and thus they're not going to be ready for life.
Yeah, I was always told that I was never going to understand math. And so um, just learn to live with it and take whatever grade you can, just pass it. And that's what I did in the beginning. It was like, I'm just going to pass because this is never going to make any sense. When I went to graduate school, I had to retake math because they didn't like the fact that I got a D plus in an early math class. And I was sweating bullets. It was like, I don't like math. I've always said I don't like math. But my son sat down with me and he said to me, "What don't you like about it?" And I said, "It's just numbers. I mean, I can add them, I can subtract them, I can divide, I can multiply. But anything else, I just don't understand why I need to know it." And so he would take me into different scenarios. And all of a sudden, it was like, now I see how to apply the concepts. So I think what you're saying is that a teacher can finally can see that in her classroom. And yes, the message is going to be the same, but she's going to be able to identify which student probably needs a little bit more coaching and seeing why they need to know this, not just this is how you get the answer.
Right. The value, like each kid, each personality type values something differently, even though we always assume that people value the same things. I think when we assume differences in people, it's generally of a surface level, like, oh, okay, they're more organized and I'm more like, I don't know, flexible. But I think there are deep ingrained values that are very different for all of us. And that's like you're saying is a perfect example. Like you didn't have purpose and you didn't know the meaning of what you were learning,
Right.
but all your son had to do is connect you to that, and then you just were like it clicked, right? And I think with a lot of kids, really teaching is just more or less communicating, connecting, right? And I think if you can connect with what someone values, it doesn't mean that it has to be your value, but you have to at least connect with it, understand it, and be able to communicate the importance of what you're teaching to that value. And once you do that, then I think kids will take off. Like they'll just it's amazing how much better they'll respond. Like, for example, the Fox personality type, they're part of a personality pack that values excitement, right? And I always say, like, you can't always tell, you can never tell one of those students to be careful. And the first thing that the majority pack, I call them gatherers, will say to one of those students is be careful because they're always taking chances, right? So as a little like 3-year old, you're gonna be like, be careful, don't do that. And I think that's a natural instinct. And that's the worst thing you can tell them because throughout their life, they're going to have to learn to get really strong by taking chances and taking risks. And you want them to learn how to take calculated risks, like risks that really they're experienced in. And if you keep telling them to be careful, they're not going to do that. And I always told my teachers, it really just means changing one word. Just don't say be careful, say concentrate or say focus. And essentially you're saying the same thing, right? You're telling them like, okay, like really focus, really like pay attention, so that you don't make any mistakes. But they interpret it so differently because when you tell them to be careful, you're telling them that there's something wrong with them. If you
Right.
tell them to focus and concentrate, you're basically telling them it's okay who you are and what you do and what you value. You just have to be good at it. And they'll understand that. They'll be like, okay, I get that. And I will concentrate. So that's just an example of how just the way that we communicate with our students is so important to connecting with them.
Well, and that same communication is so important as we go out into the world. Okay. Um, I see constantly people saying, to somebody, well, why are you in that profession? Why would you do that? Like almost trying to degrade you instead of saying, tell me more about your profession or what drew you to that profession. Um, my youngest son works in sports and he's moving from one team to another. And actually, he's moving from one sport to another sport. And somebody said to me, well, why is your son doing that? What's wrong? Didn't he like where he was living? Didn't he like his job? And it was like, well, let's hold on. Number one, It's not for me to tell you anyways. But number two, it's his choice. Okay. So maybe you want to ask some different questions. And they'd look at me and go, well, what are the questions? I'm like, well, does your son have more of an interest in what he's going to be doing now? Is it a better environment for him? Those questions I wouldn't have been as defensive with. I was defensive with, why is he doing it? What's wrong? Almost like, oh, I'm a terrible mother. I didn't bring him up properly. So when we're talking to people, we have to understand we're all different personalities. How do we learn about these personality types so maybe that we can like engage better?
Well, the first thing that I always recommend is not that I'm selling myself, but I have a website and people can take an assessment on my website and then that'll tell them what animal type they are. Now, I always put the disclaimer, look, like I'm not a huge fan of like saying these tests are end alls. A lot of them are just cookie cutter, mine included. They just ask you a cookie cutter set of questions. So I always encourage people to read the description and if it doesn't fit, then maybe take the test again or read other descriptions. But of course, that's why I wrote a book on the topic. So to be honest, the best thing to do is buy the book and then you'll understand every single personality type. It goes in depth on the methodology, hopefully in a fun way. I don't think I write about things in a way that's too technical. I try to make like jokes and pop culture references and things that people can connect to. But I think when you figure out what animal type you are and personality, then you'll start understanding, oh, this is why I value these things, and it's okay for me to be this way. But it's also helps you understand like this is why these people are this way, and my values are different. So, if I have a value of safety and security, then I might like in talking to someone, my first instinct, if I hear that they're changing jobs, might think, oh, why would you ever want to change something that you already had something very comfortable in? Because that's one of my values.
Right.
But if their values, I don't know, excitement, then they might be like, oh, this is new and exciting. I want to do this new thing versus something that I've been doing for the last 3 or 4 years. Like I always used to say, when people like for some reason, when I had my education company, a lot of my educators, my employees got divorced. But when they did, I'd always say, oh, congratulations. And I think that would throw people off a little bit because people would be like, wait, but aren't you supposed to say like, oh, like feel bad for them? And I'm like, well, they clearly made a decision, right? They clearly were not liking where they were previously. So instead of me saying like, oh, I feel so bad for you for making this decision that has ruined your life, I just generally congratulate them because I'm like, oh, clearly it was a hard decision to make and you made it and good for you. Like, and good luck, for in the future.
So, what we're talking about to our listeners is as we're going through this maze of life, we're going to run into walls occasionally. And depending on who you choose to be, and we can make those choices of who we want to be. You can stay in front of that wall and not move and just be there, or you can try to find a new path to get through. And you talked about earlier about mistakes, and we did a podcast earlier today, and we were talking about mistakes are stepping stones to find your answers. And I've been going through a lot of that the last couple of weeks. I had an injury on Christmas Eve, so I broke my shoulder, and so I'm sort of like a one-handed bandit. And my first initial reaction was after I broke it and was told, "You're not going to drive a car, Karen, until 12 weeks minimum." And it was like, oh my God. Now I work out of the home most of the time, but the thought of, oh, I can't be independent because my independence depended on the car. And my reaction, if this had happened to me 10 or 20 years ago, would have been total devastation. My personality has changed because I don't want to ever become devastated by my choice. And I realized I had a choice. I could either accept the fact that you're not going to be driving. So let's make the most of it. What are the things you can do? And I can count down the days until I do start to drive. And that's an achievement. People have to understand that we all take things differently. And that's what you're talking about when you're talking about personalities. But I do believe our personalities, we can tweak them and we can change them. if that's what we choose to do. Agree or not?
Yeah, I always, yeah, no, no, I always agree, and I always say we don't change as much as we grow, which is,
Okay.
I guess, the same thing,
Yep.
But it's always a good caveat though, because we can grow into worse versions of ourselves too. So I'm always of the belief that, yeah, like we can definitely any weaknesses that we find that are inherent in our personality, because all personalities have weaknesses. In fact, our strengths come from our weaknesses, right? So for every person's super organized, responsible person their weakness is going to be that they might be a bit of a fascist sometimes, right? But generally, you're not going to get the person who's like super flexible. Their weakness is not going to be they're going to be a fascist. They might be like irresponsible. And I think it's good to know what those weaknesses are because, like you said, we can like figure out, oh, okay, like, maybe I do take these things a little too hard, or I think, the worst thing is possible when in fact, like I just need to start connecting with that there is a positive in this and work on that. And as I focus on that, I'll grow and, mature to the point where I'm not going to let things affect me as much as possible as they do.
So you talked about the wolf. Give us another personality animal.
Um, yeah, oh wow, let's say, I'll say I'm gonna guess what your son is. I think your son, the way, or at least one of the sons that you described, who was like diagnosed being on the
Right.
spectrum. My guess would be he is a Smith. And Smiths are one personality pack. They focus on their number one priority is information. So if you're wondering how he knew so much about history even before going into class, they just like knowing things and learning things. Now, do they do it because they want a good grade or do they want to like be successful or not necessarily? They just want to know things. That's fun
Right.
for them. Now can they push that towards a level of success? For sure. Like Einstein was an example of a Smith, right? Like he just liked to know things and, at the highest level, of course. So like I would guess like a certain kind of Smith, since I mentioned Einstein, would be an owl. So owls, as you'd imagine, an owl can be a bit reclusive. Unfortunately, are like the deviant role for them. I have this idea of deviant roles, which would be an animal personality type at their worst. I believe the owls would be someone like the Unabomber, like sitting off in a cabin somewhere and just knowing a lot of stuff, but kind of being antisocial. At their worst, they're like that.
Right.
But at their best, they understand ideas. They're able to take really complex things and simplify them very like to like something like I always think of how Einstein described the theory of relativity, which is he said he explained it as if you sit with a pretty girl for an hour, it's going to seem like you sat with her for a minute. But if you sit on a hot stove for a minute, it's going to sound like, or it's going to feel like you sat on it for an hour.
Right.
And that's relativity. And I feel like that's such a great, concise way of describing a really complex theory. And I think owls as a personality type are very, very good at that.
It's interesting that you say that because I have two sons. One is an attorney, one's in sports. One who's an attorney, he is so precise in everything he does. Um, the one who's in sports is also the one on the spectrum, and um, in certain areas, very precise. Will not change. Everything is black and white. On the other hand, there's all this big area that he knows so much about. And I remember one day I got a call from his school saying he's challenging his history teacher. And I
Hmm.
thought, well, that's a good thing. And they said, yeah, but his history teacher is being proven wrong. And I said, well, maybe it's the way he's going about it that you don't like. No, we just don't want him to challenge him. And I said, no, wait a second. If his history teacher has it wrong, okay, do you want the students to learn it wrong or do you want them to have the right answer? And so instead, what they finally decided is that after class, Alex would meet with this history teacher and he had taken notes and all the areas that the teacher had misspoken. And so the next day, the teacher would start the new class, not saying that Alex brought it up, say, I think I made a few mistakes yesterday. And he would review them. And so this way, Alex wasn't calling him out in the middle of the classroom, but he was proving that, hey, you got it wrong. I'm going to get it right on the test. Everybody else is going to get it wrong based on your information. These
No,
are
no.
people,
Oh,
yeah,
oh, I was gonna say that's like a perfect example of it wasn't like he was trying to usurp his authority. He just really wanted the right information out there. It wasn't like
exactly.
an ego thing, right?
Yeah, exactly. He called me this morning as he's preparing to move, and saw something on the internet and he told me about it. And I said, "Are you sure that's right?" And he goes, "Yes, I checked all my sources." I said, "Of course you did." And then I went out and checked it afterwards. And he was right. But my first reaction was, that doesn't sound like it's the right thing. So most of us don't understand personality types. Okay. We walk into a room, we want everybody to be like us, which is boring. Do you have any recommendations how those of us walking through this path of life can start being more aware and accepting of different personalities?
I mean, the number one thing is just start understanding what the different personalities are and why they are the way they are. Like what they're, I mean, I said it a lot. So I guess I'm sounding redundant, but like the values are so important, right? Like to know that someone values something differently, especially the people closest to you. I think when I used to teach my educators, the ones that were parents were the ones who got to it the quickest, right? They were just like, oh, I get it. Like, because maybe they're not as close to their individual students, but they're definitely close to their kids. And
Right.
they're the first thing they say is, no wonder why I like this kid better than I like this kid. They always say, I love them equally, but I definitely have a favorite among them. And I'm like, yeah, it's probably because you guys have similar personalities. So you gel with them better. It doesn't mean you love them differently, but you definitely are going to like interacting with one more than the other just because you guys relate to each other more. And I think when we start using personality and discovering it and start like kind of putting people into context of personality, right? Like the people around us, then you're going to start, things are going to start clearing up. Things that confused you at first, you're going to be like, oh, no wonder why they're like that. Okay. Now, then it becomes accepting it, right? As opposed to trying to change them. I think that's a really common thing, which is why I always say people don't change, we grow, just because I feel like the people who say that people can change are often just trying to get people to change into what they want. And I think
Right.
that's the danger I found a lot working with, I've worked with a lot of students, like our company worked with about 1,000 students a year, which meant we worked with about 1,000 parents a year. And we could see that a bit, where parents are trying to go, okay, I want my kid is going to be this, and it's like, well, maybe your kid is not going to be that.
All right.
I have a student who said she wanted to be a vet. And the first thing I said is, "Oh, you're probably not going to be a vet." And she's like, "What? Why are you trying to say I'm not going to be that?" I'm like, "Well, I'm just guessing based on what I know about you and your personality, and I'm guessing that your grandparents or I'm guessing your parents told you that you should be a vet because you told them you liked animals." And she's like, "That's exactly what happened. I said I like dogs, and they're like, be a vet." And I'm like, "Well, that's not necessarily the best way to like make decisions about life." And then I found out she doesn't even like cats. So I'm like, "Well, if you don't like cats, then you're gonna have a problem."
Absolutely.
So yeah.
It's interesting that you mentioned that because before I started podcasting, I was a counselor at a private college and we had a nursing program. And of course, everybody who walked in the door, they wanted to be a nurse. And I used to sit there and go, okay, tell me why you want to be a nurse. Well, I helped take care of grandma, when grandma was sick. Okay, but that's grandma. Did you love grandma? Absolutely love grandma. Did you like being around her? Absolutely. Okay. What are some of the things you did for grandma? They tell me. All right. Now, do you know what it takes to become a nurse? And I would go through the curriculum, but I would bring out things like body fluid, blood, um, individuals who are very, very angry, on and on. And they would just sit there and they'd go pale. Well, no, I don't like the sight of blood. I had one young girl who came in. She doesn't like touching people. I said, well, that's going to be difficult as a nurse. Number one, that means you'll never be able to draw blood. You can't take their temperature because you're going to touch them in some way. Can't take their pulse. And I went through all these things and she goes, never thought about that. I said, now, if you really want to be a nurse, you can learn to overcome some of these things, but are you going to be good at it? You have to decide that. And she looked at me, she said, I don't want to be a nurse.
Huh.
And I said, makes sense. Now let's look at the things that you can do. And when we looked at that, it was like she didn't realize there was this whole other world where she could be out there helping people. And that's what she was trying to do. She helped grandma, but she wasn't a nurse. And when she finally figured that all out, it was like, well, thank you. You're the first one who was listened to me. She had applied to 4 other schools. And it was like, and they all wanted her money. Well, yeah,
Right.
my school did too, but I wasn't a counselor in that way. And that's probably why I'm not with them anymore either, because we
Yeah,
have
you're
to
trying.
do what is good for us.
Yeah, I think you're trying to help people connect to what makes them happy, right? And generally, if we do the things that we enjoy doing, that makes us happy. And I've always had the belief that, oftentimes people think, especially with personality, they're like, okay, I'm good at this. So what does that say about my personality? I'm like, well, personality doesn't tell us what we're going to be good at specifically. It tells us what we're going to like. And generally, the things that we like doing, we do more. And the more we do it, we tend to get good at it. And essentially, that's kind of what happens, right? Like, no one's born being fantastic at everything unless you're like Mozart or something. And even he had to work on it. And I think at the end of the day, if we're just trying to be happy. It's amazing how some of the obstacles that were in our life tend to disappear,
Right.
because we just don't end up seeing them because, like you said, we don't go straight at them. Maybe we just go on another path that has no obstacles versus this path that we're told we need to go on that has obstacles. Like
Exactly.
we don't have to do the things that people often tell us that we have to do.
So you ran your business, you said, for what, about 10 years?
Yeah, about a decade.
So what are you doing now? I mean, you're still somewhere in that mix.
I am. I wrote my book and my publisher put that out last year. And I do life coaching. So now, like, instead of owning I don't want to say a huge business, but a fairly large business where I had to manage different things, funny enough, I decided to get back into what my educational background was in, which was writing. And so the funny story is I was writing screenplays trying to get them sold. I live in Los Angeles. Not to say that everybody in LA is writing screenplays, but it definitely is something that a lot of people do here. And I joined a writing group, and I joined this writing group, and we go to a bar after we'd write, for a couple hours, and I brought up my personality typing methodology, and people just loved it. People started, oh, well, what animal am I? What animal am I? And they started talking about it. And a friend of mine who's a writer was like, oh, you should really write a book on that. And I was like, oh no, I want to continue writing my pilots on sex addicted rabbits. And um, she was like, well, okay. But she took the ideas and then put it into the show that she was writing on. And I was like, wow. And because she said like the writer's room really enjoyed the animal types. And I was like, well, I guess if you put it on your show, your episode, one episode she wrote, I guess I should write a book on it. So that's what I did. And I was able to get it published last year. And I'm doing that and obviously promoting my book, but also I do life coaching as well. So I've continued to do what I was doing with my education company, but I like it because I get to focus more on individuals. And I used to teach writing. So I am a writing coach. But what I found is that the key to teaching writing is not about grammar. It's not about sentence structure. It's not about like having a thesis statement and essay structure and stuff. What I discovered is it's really about finding your voice. Like if you know how to express yourself and you know the best way for you to express yourself, you can write anything. And
Absolutely.
but you can't know your voice if you don't know yourself. And that's where the life coaching comes in. So I usually start people with writing coaching, but eventually it becomes life coaching because at the end of the day, I want to hear what's important to them and I want to teach them to be able to voice those things in the way that seems the most natural to them.
It's interesting because my grandfather, my father, my two brothers have been writers, and uh, some poetry, but also um, short stories and just blogging, so to speak. And every time I would try to write, and I say try because I wanted to be at their levels. Okay. I didn't think about what I was writing. It was like, well, I'm just going to go write this because I want to be like them. And my father one day said to me, honey, leave the writing to the men in the family. And it was like, you're probably right. Your dad, you're right. Didn't do anything. When my father passed away in 2004, I sat down and wrote a eulogy. And I said to my mother, I'm going to read this. And she goes, go right ahead. Expecting I was going to try to write a poem that moon and spoon and all those words rhymed.
Mhm.
And it wasn't a poem, it was my voice. And I realized after I gave it, I didn't care if anybody said they liked it or anything. I liked it. And I knew this was my beginning. And then I started blogging back in 2004, right from then. So I think you're right. You have to know yourself. I didn't know myself, but my dad's passing hit me to the point of I know something and this is what I'm going to do. Sometimes we get those revelations overnight. Sometimes it takes us longer. Um, I'm
Yeah,
not
no,
mad at my dad for saying, leave it to the men in the family. I wish he would have stated it differently, but
yeah. I mean, there have been many women writers in history,
right.
even those pretending to be men or who had to pretend to be men. Um, but yeah, like I do. Yeah, I mean, it's all about. I think it's because when you're doing a eulogy, no one can tell you you have the confidence of your feelings, right? Because you feel a certain way. Obviously, it was your dad
Yeah,
passing, right? Like, so whatever anyone says, they're not, how can they say, no, that's wrong? You can be like, no one's ever going to do that. No one's ever going to
right.
critique a eulogy. It's going to be like, oh, this is what you honestly feel, and you should be able to express that, right? And I think that is probably why you're like, okay, this is my voice because, like, it's not that you didn't know what your voice is, it was that you didn't maybe had confidence in it and then there you had confidence because you're just gonna like, yeah, I'm gonna go
Exactly.
all out with this. And now, oh, this is people like it. And I'm only speaking from my own experience. Like that
Right.
was definitely where you grow up thinking I have to write a certain way. Oh, I have to write like this person. Or I have to write like this person. And then after you realize, wait a minute, that's all artifice at the end of the day. It's just like styles. But I need to learn how to write like me. Like, what do I really want to say, and how do I want to say it?
Exactly. So you mentioned you live in LA and we're going through some turbulent times right now. So it appears that you're safe. You're in your home. How far away are you from all the fires and craziness that's going on out there?
I don't know how many miles I am away. In LA, we always go based on how many minutes it takes us to get to places, which is always longer than the miles, if you know LA traffic. And
Right.
but I'm probably not geographically particularly far, but I am far in time wise. But I did actually have a few relatives who got evacuated stay with me last week. So I definitely am close to it in terms of familiar what's going on. I have a brother and mother who live close to the evac zone, and then uncles and stuff who also live close. So I'm conscious of it, but I'm not personally affected in that I don't have to move, thankfully.
Well, we're glad for that. And we hope that all your other family members are going to be safe because it's going through that maze. You never know when something is going to happen. And we are faced with challenges. But there are people like you out there who are giving voice to the fact that we can keep evolving. We can become the person that we want to be. But as you probably tell your clients that you coach, it's up to you to decide. I'm not going to decide for you. I have a client who every time we have a meeting, the first thing she'll say to me is, tell me what to change today. And my comment is, I'm not going to tell you what to change. What do you want to change? And do you really want to change it? Are you changing it for you? You changing it for somebody else? You have to understand those things. So, how can my listeners find you, find your book, and maybe link up with you if they're looking for a coach?
Well, so you can find the book on, well, they like to say everywhere you can purchase books. So obviously Amazon if you want to give Jeff Bezos your money, but just go to your local bookstore. You can order it through there, or maybe Barnes and Noble, one of the big box stores. You can take the test actually if you want to find out what animal personality type you are. With a disclaimer that I threw in the beginning of the show, of course, that it's just a cookie cutter test. But you can find that test at utopiaproject.com. And that's YOU, like spelled like YouTube because it's all about you. So utopiaproject.com. And you can find more about my life coaching at projectutopia.com. So if you just switch the order around, that goes to my coaching website.
And the name of the book?
The name of the book is The Power of Personality. Gosh, I can't forget to say that. The Power of Personality. Find the power of your personality by reading it, you know.
I love that. Absolutely love that. Well, Eric, thank you for joining me on this January 28th, 2025 day, and stay safe in California. I know you're warmer than we are here in Northeast Ohio. It's supposed to be wind chill of -15. So
Oh,
I'll send you some cool weather along the way.
yeah. Yeah, out here we're so spoiled. I was just complaining yesterday about how cold it was, and it was probably like 45 or 50. So yeah,
Well,
we're wimps out here.
well, hey, I'll take 45 any day. But in the meantime, thank you again, and we will direct our listeners to Eric G. Have a great day. Bye bye
Thanks so
now.
much for having me.
Thanks.